Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nerd Church. This is a space where faith, history, and scholarship meet in an approachable, curious, and nerd-friendly way. My name is Katie. I have a bachelor's degree in religious studies, and I've read both academically and on my own since I left academia. Um, a lot about the history of the early church, early Christian literature, and medieval Catholic thought. I'm especially interested in how the earliest Christian communities interpreted scripture and how the Catholic intellectual tradition has evolved through the centuries.
And I'm Aldo. I'm an industrial designer by trade, but I'm intellectually curious. So I taught myself to read ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. So I have a stronger background in rabbinic literature and the Hebrew Bible. And I'm really interested into, all these connections, cultural, linguistic, between the Old and the New Testament, using the Second Temple period literature.
Together, we want to explore something that often gets overlooked. The lectionary readings that Catholics hear every Sunday were not chosen at random. They're carefully arranged to speak to each other, the Hebrew Bible reading, the Psalm, the Epistle, and the Gospel, forming a kind of theological and literary conversation across time.
And our aim is pretty simple. We want to make sure that serious biblical scholarship remains accessible, welcoming, and genuinely helpful to people of faith. So, whether you're Catholic, curious, scholarly, or spiritually searching, Nerd Church is a place where you can deepen your understanding of Scripture and appreciate the richness of the church's tradition without intimidation or dogmatism.
And if you're not religious, this is an opportunity to get a look inside of the way that about a billion peoples are going to, because that's how many people are approximately how many people are Catholic, um, whether or not they're actually practicing at the moment, but how those people will have encountered and interpreted and been taught to interpret and interact with the Bible. So here, good scholarship isn't the enemy of faith. It's something that can make faith more meaningful by illuminating the world behind the text. And where faith is not the enemy of good scholarship, because good scholarship helps us to understand the text and to gain a fuller meaning of how the Bible can be used and applied.
Correct. And we truly believe this approach is um, deeper, and of course, it will, in the long run, it will help us get a better understanding of the message, the something closer to the original message of the church, of the texts the church bases its readings, and perhaps even you can apply to your daily life as a believer, as a scholar, or just as an intellectually curious person.
Yes. So with that, let's begin. The first thing that I should probably start with is what the heck is a lectionary? And a lectionary, very simply, is a is not the entire Bible. It is instead a selection of texts from the Bible that are used that are read in Catholic churches every Sunday, that are designed to guide people through reading the scriptures in a organized and systematic way. What I have right here that I'm holding up is the workbook for lectors, gospel readers, and proclaimers of the word. And you can see that we are starting year A, which was part of the reason why Aldo and I decided that now was a really good time to start in on this project, because we're starting a new liturgical year, and we're also starting a completely new cycle of readings, which I'll get to in just a second. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. Very early on, there was before Christianity was even fully separate from Judaism. So we're talking first century. Christians adopted the habit of regular reading of the Bible, and or rather, I should say, what would become the Bible, because the Bible as we know it had not yet formed. That's more of a development of the 4th and 5th century. But and in Judaism, this was at the point where Judaism was developing the system that's still in place of dividing the Torah, so the first 5 books of Moses, into portions, so that over the course of a year, and now most Jewish communities use a 3-year cycle as things have developed, that lets you read through the entire Torah in either a 1-year or a 3-year cycle. And Christian communities sort of at first were probably just this part is a little less certain, but early on Christian communities were pretty much just piggybacking off of that custom. And then so that by the year 155, Justin Martyr has his famous description of a Sunday meeting. And he says that the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read. Of course, he very frustratingly doesn't tell us, oh, this is what we're reading, which would help settle a lot of questions about which gospels were in circulation, what things that didn't make it into the canon were still being read and studied in the 2nd century, and so on. But so very quickly on, you develop the idea that, okay, we're going to read sections. And prior to the 5th century, what this looks like is in the actual full text of the Bible, you would just have like a line drawn on the center. Okay, read this paragraph. The first actual lectionary was created by a man named Musaeus of Marseille in the mid-1st century. And then in the 16th century, at the Council of Trent, we had a codified missal that was used throughout the Roman Catholic Church. And at that time, you only actually had 2 readings. You had a reading from a gospel, and then another reading, which would be taken from either the Hebrew Bible or an epistle, or sometimes from the Acts of the Apostles. And then that was the way things were until the 1960s. And that was when Vatican II happened. Vatican II is the most recent of the sort of great councils of the churches, where all of the bishops got together. And one of the things that they decided was that Catholics need to read the Bible more. and they need to have more exposure to the Bible. And obviously, the best way to guarantee that Catholics are getting at least a little bit of a Bible is to have it read aloud on Sundays. Now, just to kind of put this in perspective, and there's a really neat chart that this Jesuit priest came up with that I will link in the show notes. But in the Tridentine lectionary, which was a 1-year cycle, and you read the same passages every year, you read about 16% of the New Testament and about 1% of the Hebrew Bible. Now, this got changed to there's still a daily reading cycle, which is separate. If you include the Sunday and the daily reading cycle, so if you're one of the little old ladies who goes to Mass every single day, you will have heard 71.5% of the New Testament and 13.5% of the Old Testament. And if you go to Mass every Sunday, like a normal person, you will have heard by the end of the 3-year cycle, 40.8% of the New Testament and 3.7% of the Old Testament. So still not a ton, but definitely an increase. And there's still an attempt to improve biblical literacy by making sure that people have at least been exposed to the whole thing in a church context. One of the biggest changes that really stuck out to me, for example, is that now the New Testament readings are drawn from everything except the second and third letters of John and the letter of Jude. Whereas previously it was basically the Tridentine Mass was basically you read Paul and a little bit of Peter and a little bit of James and a little bit of First John, and that was it. And there was no readings from Revelation, actually. And then the Vatican II, the current lectionary, which was adopted at Vatican II, adds in Revelation from the New Testament, as well as more epistles. And also adds a lot more variety from the Old Testament. So, for example, the Tridentine lectionary was just Genesis, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Baruch, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, and Jonah. Now it's a much longer list that I won't torture everyone by reading, but it includes, some of the more obscure ones like Sirach and Habakkuk and Zephaniah and Malachi. Although some of those only get one reading. Oh, and Nehemiah. Although interestingly, as much as Catholics like to get salty when we're talking to Protestants or possibly smug and be like, well, the Catholic Bible includes, all of this stuff from the Deuterocanon, like Maccabees and Tobit and Ruth and so on, that not all Christians include. The truth of the matter is that the only thing that is actually read at Mass that doesn't show up in any of the Protestant Bibles is Maccabees. Um, so just being honest about that. Okay, so that is all that I had about the history and composition of the lectionary. Was there anything that you wanted to bring up?
Sure, Katie, thank you. So I hope the audience is already visualizing what we're trying to do here. So aside from complementing this idea of the church of trying to get the people to read or to get exposed to more material of the Bible, um, we will actually talk about the way these readings are connected thematically, and also some history on linguistic stuff, um, the early church fathers and the early, this early Christian literature, perhaps even some links into Second Temple Judaism, rabbinic literature, which, although late, sometimes carries on some very early concepts and some very early traditions, and they may even shed light and make some obscure passages even clearer. That's pretty much the idea behind all this, so that people can have a more solid context on where this literature comes from, and that it is not just something isolated from a society, a Mediterranean society in that specific era.
Yes, exactly. And also so that people understand kind of how reading the Bible and interacting with the Bible looks in the context of a living religious tradition.
Correct.
That this isn't, something that, just sits on your shelf. And that also at the same time, nobody's like necessarily that people are not in the Catholic tradition being encouraged to like go through Deuteronomy with a highlighter, as they compile a list of who we're going to try to set on fire this week. I think it's safe to say that the Catholic Church has decided that it's time to go back to the sternly worded email phase of theological dispute. So anyway, with that, I said that I would mention a little bit more about the current lectionary cycle. So right now there is a 3-year lectionary cycle. Year A, which is Matthew, year B, which is Mark, and year 3, which is Luke. That means that the gospel readings will be drawn primarily from those 3 books. And the reason for that is because those are what's called the synoptic gospels. So those are the ones that are most interested in kind of telling a narrative story about the life of Christ. And then the Gospel of John is just kind of in there as this sort of free floating thing that gets plugged in, mostly when there's a particular point of there's a particular theological point that John is making that the people who compiled the lectionary want to highlight. And so we are right now at the very beginning of a new cycle. So we are starting with the Gospel of John, but I'm sorry, with the Gospel of Matthew, but it's one of the things that you'll notice immediately is that none of this is being read synchronously. So we're not starting with Matthew 1, we're starting with Matthew 24. For reasons that will be pretty obvious once we get reading, and you can kind of see, hopefully, the thematic connections. I should also mention that we are starting the liturgical season of Advent, which in not just the Catholic Church, but also in the Orthodox churches and the Lutheran and the Anglican communions as well, which in the United States are the Episcopalians, also follow roughly the same liturgical calendar. And I should mention that the Catholic lectionary in the 90s was adopted with some modifications as the New Revised Lectionary. So if anyone watching this is a Protestant who belongs to one of those churches, a lot of this will also be very familiar and will be the way that you're kind of experiencing the Gospels throughout the year. And also, you're welcome for, the lectionary. So, anyway, so Advent is the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, which is, of course, the day on which the birth of Jesus is celebrated because of reasons that we can maybe get into on our Christmas episode. And so there are 4 Sundays in Advent, and this is the first one. And one of the things that that I just want to bring up as we're reading through there is we're not starting out with, happy stories about the manger, because Advent is meant to be sort of a season of reflection and kind of just thinking about the fact, you know what? Without Jesus, things would really suck. And things get better with Jesus, which seems like, a pretty anodyne, not very important kind of a message. But, sometimes it's worth, I think, taking a moment to sort of just sit down and reflect about where we are and how we got there. So without further ado, I will begin, unless you had something else to say, I will begin with the first reading, which is Isaiah 2, verse 1 through 5.
Please go on, Katie.
Okay. So, a reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the days to come, the mountains of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest mountain and raised above the hills. All nations shall stream towards it, and many people shall come and say, "Come, let us climb the Lord's mountain to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, and we may walk in his paths. For from Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and impose terms on many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. One nation shall not raise the sword against another, nor shall they train again for war. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." And then we have a responsorial psalm, which will either be sung or will just be read aloud, depending on whether or not the church has music at that particular Mass. I will not force Aldo to chant the response, but just know that if this was going on in a church, the lector would read, let us go rejoicing to the house of the Lord. And then after each paragraph would pause, and then the entire congregation would reply. Or if it's being sung, the person who's singing it would sing the verse, and then everybody in the building would sing the response. And either way, when you have, 100 or so people chanting or singing, like it's very affecting. Like it's this, it's hard to describe as an experience, but it just feels, it gives you a sense of belonging and connection in a really strange way that, it's very much like if you've ever been to a rock concert and the singer starts with like their big hit that everyone's there to see, and the whole crowd is singing along together. It's that kind of a feeling. Okay, so, and the psalm is Psalm 122, verses 1 through 9. I rejoiced because they said to me, we will go up to the house of the Lord. And now we have set foot within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city with compact unity. To it the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord. According to the decree for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. In it are set up the judgment seats, seats for the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you prosper. May peace be within your walls, prosperity in your buildings. Because of my brothers and friends, I will say, peace be with you. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will pray for your good. Okay, so now we get to the reading of the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, which, if you're following along, is Romans 13, 11 through 14. Brothers and sisters, you know the time. It is now the hour for you to awake from sleep. For our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is advanced and the day is at hand. Let us then throw off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us conduct ourselves properly as in the day, not in orgies or drunkenness, not in promiscuity and lust, not in rivalry and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the desires of the flesh. And then the fourth and final reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, and this is Matthew chapter 24, verse 37 through 44. So here is our reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, as it was in the day of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. In those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, up into the day when Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came and carried them all away. So it will be also at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be taken out to the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on which day your Lord will come. Be sure of this. If the master of the house had known the hour of the night when the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not let his house be broken into. So you too also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come. Okay, so I think that the first thing we can say here is that basically this is all talking about Jesus is coming, both, celebrating the birth of Jesus at Christmas and also significantly tying the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. And one thing that I want to highlight is that for people who were raised in a Protestant church that believes in the rapture, this section of Matthew is very often used to be like, oh, right before Jesus comes back, there's going to be a rapture. Two men will be in the field, one will be taken, right? And I think I would like to establish that the policy of this channel is that we are Protestant friendly, but we are not heresy friendly. And the rapture, in addition to being a formal heresy according to the Catholic Church, I think is one that's worth kind of pushing against a little bit, just because it is something that causes people a tremendous amount of distress and emotional harm. I know several people who have described, yeah, one day I woke up from a nap and my whole family was gone and I thought the rapture was happened and I was left. And, just like crying hysterically. And I'm bringing this up mostly to emphasize that that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is this is saying at some point Jesus is going to come back. And it could be tomorrow, it could be in a billion years. We don't know. So that the important thing is, as Paul says, to be ready. And of course, being Paul, it tends to involve a lot of not making provisions for the desires of the flesh. Because one thing that's very clear from Paul is he was just sort of very offended by the fact that he had a human body. I think is probably the fairest characterization of Paul. And so basically, just kind of, the fairly, basic, don't have why, you can still have fun. Just, well, I should say the standard Catholic interpretation is that you can still have fun. Just, don't let things get out of hand. Which was, why in the Middle Ages, it was extremely common to have, big dances on the front lawn of the church because, people are going to be dancing some way. So you might as well have it be in a controlled environment. And recently in Romania, the Pope hosted you'll see a lot of headlines. The Pope hosted a rave because there was a very large EDM concert, and it's very cool. I'll try to find a link to the whole show in the show notes. But basically the idea is, don't let things get out of hand. Drinking is okay, not so much drunkenness. Just don't give in to all of those bad impulses, because you have to be ready at any time. So obsessing about, oh, the end time is going to come right now, is, in the Catholic view, kind of counterproductive. I apologize very much. Someone just knocked on my front door. It's probably a good thing that now that I think about it, it's probably a good thing we're recording this so we can edit out things like door knocks and dogs. Um, okay, so that was kind of my initial thoughts. And then I know that um, Aldo, did you want to start by telling what you had come up with as far as the Hebrew Bible passages go?
Sure. So going back to Isaiah, um, we should say that this is so the whole idea regarding all these readings is the way I see it is they are trying to tell us to be prepared, not to be distracted by mundane acts, and then get caught in the middle of the Son of Man coming back to earth, in this case, Jesus. And that is why people should be, you know, they should be conscious. And in some way, this reading from Isaiah tries to tell us the result of what would happen once we rejoice in this second coming. As you all know, in the Catholic tradition, Isaiah is a very big book regarding prophecies about the foreshadowing of the coming of Christ, and we can see it here. So, in the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. So that is and all the nations shall stream to it. So it would be the focal point where people would just go back to this original site, to this original place where the temple once stood. And I would like to add a small linguistic note in this regard, because in verse 2 it says, all the nations shall stream to it. So there's a bit of a debate. The older reading was to interpret this Hebrew verb, which is called nahar, which is similar to the word river in Hebrew. And this is where this idea comes from, that people should just stream back to the mountain of the Lord, as if, let's say, as if it were a river going against gravity. So instead of going down, it would go up. But some research into other Semitic languages, just as Hebrew, mostly tell us that this interpretation is erred, in the sense that this word mostly has to do with eyesight. So what they are trying to say is that people will just lighten up their eyes, their sight will lighten up because of this change into the way they perceive the mountain of the Lord. And then, as you will see, it is always in the Old Testament, it is always about paths. It is about conduct. So we're talking here about perhaps an idea that the Torah, as some form of the text of the Torah, the Pentateuch, already exists, and that is the code of conduct which people will eventually have to follow to finally, get back to Zion, get back to God. And in some sense, the Gospel of Matthew is big on this topic, preserving the Jewish law, all the more instead of, let's say, the other Gospels are place less emphasis on fulfilling the law.
Yes, and one thing that we should mention is that in is that there, any I the sound that you hear in the background is all of the Old Testament scholars screaming that Jesus is not mentioned anywhere in Isaiah. And I should mention that that's true because one of the really cool ideas that Catholic theologians have come up with to deal with this is the idea that you kind of have prophecy that does not, that you can have hidden prophecy that doesn't become evident until the events of the prophecy have been fulfilled. So it's like Isaiah was writing this, and it wasn't until later that Jesus was, after Jesus had been born and everything had happened, that then people went back and went, oh, this is obviously talking about Jesus, right? It's, so it's kind of in the same way that, um, so in that view, prophecy can be sort of like if you have a favorite song and when you hear that song it reminds you of, oh, that was this event that happened in my life that was very significant. And it's like they're writing about me. They know how I feel. They know what it means. Well, obviously the songwriter didn't, but that doesn't detract from the that doesn't mean that your experience and your relationship to the song is inauthentic and untrue. It just means that all of this is kind of is understood to be sort of happening in this kind of eternal conversation where we're basically putting all of these books together and letting them talk to each other and then seeing what they say back to us.
Correct. I would like to add something, and that is that, well, it all has to do with whether it becomes practical and useful to you if you want to make that kind of interpretations. But from a historical or textual perspective, it isn't the case. So it doesn't mean that you're wrong in a sense, but it is just two different areas of knowledge. So if
Yeah.
you want to go back to this primary or more original or ancient interpretation of the text, then you would have to separate this idea of Isaiah being flooded with references to Jesus. But if we're talking on the side of faith, then it would be useful for you as a Catholic to, to find all these connecting threads, which will enrich in your experience as a Catholic.
Yes. But I think that it's, always important to point out that if we're talking from a strictly historical perspective,
Mhm.
that Isaiah was writing about and for what was going on in his own time. And the fact that other people have been able to interact with and rework this text in some sense in a way that it continues to be meaningful for them and their spiritual practice is also, is still worth talking about and worth considering.
Totally.
Yeah, and that both things can be true at the same time.
Exactly. That is the idea. So um, you would have to, let's say, be aware, perhaps that is the one of the objectives of this channel, to have people understand that they can understand both both texts as separate entities, but at the same time separate entities with a life of their own. But at the same time, if they consider it necessary, they can just use the traditional church traditions. You can just innovate, but always trying to be careful, respectful with the texts, and first of all, trying to understand the text in a deeper level, on a deeper level, instead
Yes,
of just giving it a cursory reading.
yes, exactly so. Did you have any other thoughts about Isaiah?
Sure, I would just want to comment on uh, verse 4. And so it says, He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And you will notice in the rest of the readings that there is a constant call to action. And it is action the one that brings change to the world, just in the same way that verse 4 tells us that, swords and spears, which are, um, weapons for waging war against each other, can become tools for agriculture, which is creative instead of destructive. And that is a connecting thread, which you will notice in the rest of the readings.
Yes, and again, like and the other thing that's interesting is a lot of these, they're very sort of these are like lower class peasant kind of metaphors. Um, because we're talking about people working in the field, we're talking about women grinding grain, we're talking about, even in Paul, the sins that he's talking about, are um, rivalry and jealousy and drunkenness and lust and things that are kind of those are sins that are available to everyone, right? Whereas like if you're a really poor person, you're not necessarily going to have an opportunity for greed, or an opportunity to, be really oppressing a lot of people. But, you know, drunkenness is, a vice that a lot of people can
Mhm.
indulge in, whether they can afford it or not. And that's one thing that, is all that is, kind of bringing everything down. So all of these passages, I think, too, are kind of bringing things down to like a very basic human level, in a way that I think is interesting.
Correct. Well, regarding Isaiah, I think I'm done. If you wish, we can just move on to the next reading.
Yeah. I don't really have anything very much to say about the Psalms. I kind of
Mhm.
feel like the Psalms are kind of in there more for kind of flavor than and to kind of get your mind in gear for the subsequent readings more than necessarily saying anything really significant on their own. There are some that I think are worth unpacking, but I think we can just kind of move on to Paul. Um, Obviously, one of the things that is very clear from this section of Romans, and I should mention that there are letters of Paul that made it, or rather, there are letters attributed to Paul that made it into the New Testament, that are now generally not believed to have been written by Paul. Interestingly, this shows up in the lectionary. So the books like Hebrews that now most scholars agree were not written by Paul will just be labeled the letter to the Hebrews. And we're just not going to get into who wrote it. Um, now, and Romans, which is attributed to, which actually is a good example of how critical scholarship is being used to inform the reading of the Bible, right? Because, you are not, as a Catholic, required or even necessarily encouraged to believe that Paul wrote Hebrews. Whereas Romans, which is pretty much accepted by everyone as being an authentic letter of Paul, is labeled as being from Paul. I think the big thing that I want to highlight here is just the fact that Paul is obviously talking to an audience that believes that the world is going to end really soon. This is still at the phase of what what is still, kind of in this early Jesus movement, kind of expecting the second coming, like within the lifetime of everybody who's reading this letter. So when Paul is saying get ready, he definitely means get ready just right now. And then the same, I think, is probably true for Matthew. One of the things that I want to bring up is this really wonderful book. It's called The Five Gospels, produced by the Jesus Seminar, which was this somewhat controversial scholarly group that was running mostly in the 80s and 90s, although they're still active, called the Jesus Seminar, that was kind of a mixture of scholars and interested lay people. And one of the things that they were interested in was what in the gospel represents the actual authentic words of Jesus. So they published a new translation, and I'm going to hold it up. I hope that people can see it. And the parts that they think that Jesus absolutely did not say are in black, stuff that's Jesus maybe said will be in gray. Things that Jesus probably said are in blue, and stuff that Jesus definitely, they're 99% positive, are in black. Now, they were using sort of a minimalist interpretation. And also, they were of the opinion that the apocalypticism in the Gospels was coming primarily from John, and then got sort of John the Baptist, that is, and then kind of got into the early Jesus movement that way, and then was revived, particularly after the destruction of the temple, of the Second Temple in 70. That is so when so as a result, they put everything in Matthew, in this section of Matthew 24:37 through 44, as being black. So not Jesus, except for the parts about the two men in the field, one taken, and the two women grinding grain, which I think is kind of interesting, because because it's hard for me to kind of imagine the one will be taken and one will be left that isn't happening in some kind of an apocalyptic context. And I should note that kind of in the last 20 years or so, the kind of predominant, the pendulum has kind of swung back to want among scholars to want to talk about Jesus as being not necessarily primarily an apocalyptic preacher, but that apocalypticism was an important part of his message. And even this kind of, and like I say, even this kind, which I think you can kind of see how even in this very like minimalist, Jesus was not apocalyptic at all, just based on the variety of sources of biblical texts that include the thing about the two men in the field and the two women grinding grain, that even this most strict reading is pretty sure that Jesus might have said something about that. And that's one of the things, and this passage of Matthew is actually one of the things that scholars who want to talk about Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher will very often, use this passage of Matthew. Because, like I say, even people who are being very strict about, we're not going to look for apocalypticism in Jesus, still think that there's a little bit of there. There's a little something going on. At least with the idea that something is going to happen to one person and not another in kind of an apocalyptic setting. And that was really kind of all I had about those two gospels, although I believe you said that you had some insights to share about how Jews in the first century were interacting with Noah, which was something I was really curious to hear about, because I think that it gives us kind of an idea of what Jesus might have, what Jesus, or the person, the person who wrote the Gospel of Matthew was thinking of, at least when they decided to link Jesus's statements about the apocalypse to the flood of Noah.
Right. Noah is one of these biblical characters who has drawn, who makes the imagination of the people, whether the Jews or the Christians, run wild. So he becomes a hero of later medieval myths, and receiving, ancient books of magic, ancient lore, and different things. And
it's such a great story. I
right,
mean, yeah, I mean, it's such a great story. You can see why people just go kind of crazy with it.
exactly. And this is not the exception, because this reference to Noah in this particular passage of the Gospel according to Matthew is not random. So there's this, for those of you who do not know, there's this literature in Judaism which is called the Targumim, which are basically ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, and they start to take shape around the time of Jesus. Most scholars would tell you they start from around the year 130, and they would go up to the 10th century. So it is not uniform, but there are some ancient traditions. And in this case, we have, for example, the Targumim and the rabbinic literature would tell you that Noah knew about the flood before it happened, and he was getting ready. So he would plant some cedar trees, and he would wait some 120 years for them to, to grow to a size in order to build the ark. And people would gather around him and they would ask him why would he be building the ark. And when he explained to them about the coming flood, people would just uh, blow it off and just look the other way. And this is where the Gospel of Matthew connects with this tradition. So people are, it isn't that people get suddenly swept away because of the flood. They already knew about the flood, but they didn't really care about the message. And this is the kind of tradition that the Gospel of Matthew echoes in this passage. So I thought it was interesting to bring it up because there are these tenuous connections. For example, in the previous reading about coming from the letter to the Romans, there's lots of apocalyptic language, all these contrasts between light and darkness, spiritual awakening, and being spiritually asleep. They all come from apocalyptic literature in the Second Temple period. And any kind of person who would be in front of Paul or perhaps receiving this letter and listening to its contents would know exactly what Paul was talking about. Spiritual awakening is talked about and mentioned in the book of Jubilees, the book of Enoch, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people knew this literature. So it was just um, these kind of ideas which were in the air in that moment, in that time, in that region. And it was, kind of a common expression in that culture.
Yeah. So it makes sense that we're talking about, now it's just staying awake, being ready, and kind of connecting all of these pieces together as we move through the season of Advent.
Correct.
Okay, so I think that that is all I have for today. Um, this has been, I think, interesting and hopefully helpful as we get off to a start. Um, and we'll kind of go forward from here. So if you like this video, if give us a like and share it. If you don't like it, tell us why, and we will try to improve it. If you are a scholar or an interested person who's interested in coming in with a get as a guest, please drop us an email. Our address is nerdchurchofficial, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you next week for Nerd Church. Bye.